Hello and welcome to Annie's Short Stories. I hope you enjoy this story. I'm going to try and upload a new story each day. The Vanishing Children. The town of Blackwater on the Isle of Wight was quiet, tucked between rugged cliffs and the misty coastline. But now a suffocating dread had settled over it, like a fog that refused to lift. Holly Arnold was one of the few people who still ventured outside at night, her footsteps echoing on cobblestone streets as she searched for answers. It began on a brisk October evening when the first child vanished. 11-year-old Danny Sykes had been walking home from the village square, his backpack slung over one shoulder, filled with books he loved reading by flashlight under his covers. He had never made it home. Then, barely a day later, another child disappeared, 5-year-old Emily Wright, whose mother had left her napping in her bedroom only to return to an empty bed and an open window. And soon after that, yet another. Townsfolk whispered in hushed voices, watching the sunset from behind locked doors and shuttered windows, casting wary glances at any shadow that dared linger too long. Holly was no stranger to the strange. Growing up in Blackwater, she had heard countless tales of apparitions and shadows that haunted the cliffs and caverns, of ghostly sailors who cried out at night, warning of dangers unseen. But this felt different. Each child had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the faint scent of seawater, a chilling reminder of the ocean's hold on the island. The townsfolk began to speak of the figure. It had been spotted more than once by those few brave souls who dared to keep watch, huddled behind curtains or peering from attics. Tall, unnaturally thin, draped in rags that seemed to shimmer and billow even in the stillness, the figure glided through the streets as though it had stepped out of a nightmare. Holly, a woman with no family left in Blackwater, felt compelled to help. She had spent her entire life here, knew every cobbled street, every weather-worn house, and every crumbling headstone in the town's ancient cemetery. She had always felt that if something dark was lurking on the island, she would be among the first to know. One night, Holly decided to stay out later than usual. The town had become a ghost of its former self, its liveliness dulled, and she walked with only the whisper of wind as her companion. She reached the edge of the forest, where a row of twisted trees created a dark, skeletal canopy over the pathway. And then she saw the figure. It was standing under the glow of an ancient street lamp, pale and shivering. Its limbs were unnaturally long, almost too thin, and it appeared to be cloaked in layers of seaweed and tattered fabric that clung to its frame. Holly froze, the chill from the nearby sea coursing through her veins as she realized that it wasn't just standing there, it was watching her. The figure lifted its head, and Holly felt a sharp pang in her chest. Its face was hollow, featureless, save for two dark pits where eyes should have been. It raised a hand, slowly pointing to a place beyond the town, a place Holly had heard whispers of but had never dared to visit. The hollowed cove. The cove was a treacherous, hidden strip of land at the base of the cliffs, only visible at low tide. Many believed it to be cursed, a place where ancient, malevolent spirits rested uneasily. Holly had always avoided it, sensing an ominous pull she couldn't quite explain. But now she felt drawn to it, as if an invisible thread had tied her fate to the cove. With dawn creeping over the horizon, Holly returned to her small cottage, her mind racing. She could barely sleep, haunted by the image of the figure and the feeling that the answer she sought lay somewhere within the cove. By nightfall, she was ready, her flashlight and a small satchel packed with only the essentials. The ocean was calm as she made her way down the cliffs, her heart pounding in her chest. The cove was silent, the kind of silence that felt almost unnatural, as though the rocks and sea had ceased to breathe. Holly's flashlight flickered over the wet sand, and she saw something that made her gasp, a row of small footprints, barely visible in the shifting sand, leading deeper into the shadows of the cove. A Holly voice called, faint and childlike. She spun around, her light catching only more darkness. But then she saw them, the figures of children, faint and translucent, drifting between the rocks. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with an emptiness that sent a chill down her spine. "Danny?" Holly whispered, recognizing their familiar features, though their expressions were blank, as though they had been drained of life. The children said nothing, only stared, their faces twisted with an unspoken sadness. And then, from the shadows, the figure emerged, its form towering over her. Holly felt an overwhelming urge to run, but her feet were rooted in place, their thickening as the figure loomed closer, bringing with it the stench of salt and decay. "What?" Holly stammered, clutching her flashlight like a talisman. The figure tilted its head, and though it had no mouth, she could feel it speaking to her, its words filling her mind with a cold, hollow voice. "I am the keeper of the lost," it whispered. "They are bound to me, taken by the sea, the forgotten by the living." Holly cried, feeling a surge of anger. "If these children have families, people who love them, they are not forgotten." The figure leaned closer. The children's forms grew fainter, their expressions fading into a haunting blankness. "Once taken, they belong to the depths. You cannot save them, Holly Arnold, but you may join them." As the figure's shadow stretched over her, Holly felt a pull. She stumbled, struggling against an invisible current that threatened to consume her. But then she heard a distant voice calling her name. A child's voice, pure and familiar. At Holly, she turned, seeing the faint outline of Emily. Holly grasped it, feeling warmth pierce the cold that had settled in her bones. With a surge of strength, she pulled herself away from the figure, dragging Emily with her. The figure let out a scream, a sound like crashing waves and roaring winds, and as Holly stumbled back, she saw it dissolve into the mist, the children's forms fading along with it. One by one, they vanished into the sea, a final whisper of relief passing over them. As dawn broke, Holly found herself alone in the cove, the scent of seawater and decay lingering. She stumbled back to the village, her heart heavy with the weight of those she couldn't save, but resolute in the knowledge that she had saved at least one. For days afterward, the town remained quiet, no more children disappearing, no shadowed figure haunting the streets. But Holly knew that the sea was never truly silent, that the island held memories and secrets that would never fade. And sometimes, late at night, she thought she could still hear the faint sound of children's laughter on the wind, a reminder that, even in the darkest depths, some light could be found. Holly Arnold thought she'd seen the last of the horrors that plagued Blackwater. But the nights following her encounter at the hollowed cove were restless, filled with strange, dreamlike whispers. Every time she closed her eyes, the cries of the children drifted back to her, mingling with the relentless crash of the ocean against the cliffs. One cold, fog-heavy evening, Holly couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Shadows flickered along her cottage walls, drifting as though alive. Every so often, her window would rattle, as if someone or something was outside, beckoning her. On the third night she heard it again, the faint, desperate voice of a child. Holly, she jolted upright in bed. The voice was coming from outside her window. She crept over, her heart thundering, and cautiously peered out into the darkness. There, at the edge of her property, she saw a young boy standing alone under the silver glow of the moon. It was Danny Sykes, the boy who'd vanished weeks ago. "Ah?" Holly whispered, rushing outside. Her footsteps were loud against the silence, and the night air bit through her thin nightgown. But as she approached him, she saw that something was terribly wrong. Danny's face was pale, his eyes hollow and distant, his clothes dripping with seawater. "Help us," he murmured. His gaze was unfocused, fixed somewhere beyond her, as though staring into the depths of the ocean itself. Before Holly could respond, he turned and began walking toward the forest path that led back to the cliffs. "Wait," she called. But Danny moved with a strange, unnatural grace, disappearing into the shadows. Holly's instinct screamed at her to turn back, to leave the past behind, but she knew she couldn't ignore this. Her resolve hardened as she followed him, each step pulling her closer to the cliffs. The fog thickened as she neared the edge, swirling around her like a living thing. She could barely see a few feet in front of her, but she kept going, clutching her flashlight as if it could banish whatever haunted the darkness. Then, as she rounded a bend, she saw a lone figure, standing at the cliff's edge. It was the same entity she had encountered before, shrouded in tattered cloth and seaweed, its hollow face turned toward her. And there, standing beside it, was Danny, along with a dozen other children, silent, unmoving, staring with empty eyes. At Holly Arnold, the figure hissed. "You should have left?" Holly demanded, feeling her hands tremble. "If the children belong to the depths," it replied. "They are bound to me, claimed by the tide. Yet you dared to break my hold." Holly's mind raced. Why take them? Why not leave them in peace? The living forget, the figure said. But the ocean does not. It holds their memories, their pain, and when it calls, they must answer. Holly's gaze darted between the children. She felt a surge of anger, of grief, knowing that these children, so full of life, had been reduced to mere shadows of themselves. There has to be a way to release them, to give them peace. The figure regarded her in silence for a moment, and then it spoke. There is a price. For every soul released, another must take its place. The sea is insatiable, and it demands tribute. She knew what it was asking, what the cost would be. Her life for theirs. She took a shuddering breath, casting one last look at the children. They seemed to waver, a faint glimmer of hope breaking through the despair in their eyes. "We're fine," she said. "Take me, but let them go." The figure tilted its head, and for a brief moment Holly thought she saw a flicker of something, approval. It extended its hand, a cold, mist-like appendage, and Holly took it, feeling a wave of icy numbness wash over her. As she closed her eyes, she felt herself falling, sinking, the chill of the ocean wrapping around her like a shroud. Memories rushed past her of the town, the children's laughter, the faces of the people she'd grown up with. She felt the darkness closing in, pulling her deeper, and she welcomed it, knowing that the children would finally be free. And then, just as suddenly, the cold faded, replaced by a strange warmth. Holly's eyes fluttered open, and she found herself back on the cliff's edge, the dawn light breaking over the horizon. The children were no longer bound to the darkness, no longer wandering the shadows. A gentle breeze brushed against her face, carrying with it the faint sound of children's laughter, fading into the distance. She stood alone, feeling a deep, aching emptiness where the children's spirits had been. But she also felt a profound sense of peace, knowing they were free. As she turned to leave, a flicker of movement caught her eye. There, just at the edge of the cliff, stood the figure, watching her. Its hollow face seemed almost softer now, less menacing, and it nodded once before vanishing into the mist, leaving only silence in its wake. Holly walked back to Blackwater, her heart heavy but her spirit unburdened. She had given the children what they deserved, a chance to be remembered, a chance to find peace. And though the shadow of the sea would always linger over the town, she knew that, for now, the children were safe. But as she neared her cottage, she felt a strange tug, a chill that whispered at the edges of her mind. And she knew that, one day, the sea would call again. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please don't forget to like, and even better, like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and I hope you have had a great day.